Richard Nixon said of the Vietnam War, "North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that." It was much more than just a conflict in Southeast Asia. It represented a clash between two different ideologies, and the world would never be the same. This conflict was between democracy and communism, and between independence and colonialism. The United States jumped into the Vietnam conflict, determined to stop the spread of communism at any cost, not realizing that it would cost the lives of well over 55,000 American soldiers for what is now seen as a fool's errand. This political disaster shook the United States, causing many people to wonder how their country could possibly be defeated in a war that they had no direct claim to. What was the Vietnam War about? America was not originally part of the Vietnam War. The conflict began between the French and the Vietnamese people. For over 65 years, Vietnam was a French colony, and like many other colonies, it suffered from repression and discrimination. Instead of allowing the Vietnamese to have some control over their government, the French repopulated the government with French officials, banned the native language, and forced Vietnam to become a rice exporter. In fact, they were so dedicated to making money that they allowed the country's poor people to suffer from famines during poor harvest seasons. Revolts began almost as soon as the French landed in the country, but they were mostly uncoordinated, allowing the French to squelch most of them quickly. All of this tension came to a head in World War II. Japan seized Vietnam. After Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh stepped forward, declaring the country's independence. France, however, took its colonies back in Southeast Asia, which included Vietnam. They took Saigon and prepared to invade the rest of the country. However, the Vietnamese wanted their own independent country. The scrimmages between the two sides escalated into the First Indochina War. The war was divided between the cities and the rural communities. France controlled the cities, but the Vietnamese guerrilla fighters had village support. France tried to end the war peacefully by reinstating Bao Dai as the emperor, but he was not as popular as another famous leader, Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, France withdrew its troops and agreed to offer Vietnam its independence. Vietnam was split into two. The Communist North was controlled by Ho Chi Minh, while the Democratic South was controlled by Bao Dai. This brings us to 1955, the start of the Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh found allies for his dream of a unified Vietnam in Communist China, and as they supplied weapons and military training to the Vietnamese, the war took a dangerous turn. It quickly turned from a war about colonization into a war about communism, as China supported the North Vietnamese and the Americans supported the South Vietnamese. How did America get involved? Since the original war was between France and Vietnam, America wasn't directly involved in the First Indochina War. They didn't join the conflict until the Second Indochina War, better known as the Vietnam War. American involvement was a little complicated, especially because the fight didn't concern them. The U.S. initially aided the French during the First Indochina War by providing funding and weapons. After South Vietnam had a new leader, one selected by Western powers, the U.S. continued to support the anti-communist South. Ho Chi Minh led North Vietnam, and he continued to push for the country's unification. He increased his efforts in 1959 when Lê Xuan, a veteran communist, convinced Minh that he would lose the South forever if he did not act now. In 1960, the Viet Cong was established. This was a communist organization that took direction from North Vietnam but was stationed in South Vietnam and other nearby countries. Tensions in the South increased under President Ngo Dinh Diem, who took office in 1955. He was authoritarian. He crushed communist cells, confiscated privately held land in the villages, and started government-run farms. He uprooted villages, refused to invest in infrastructure, and made his military buddies village leaders, even though competent statesmen would have been better suited for the job. This behavior should have rung some alarm bells for the United States, but they continued to support Diem because he was anti-communist. Diem's government caused an increase in guerrilla attacks while gaining popular support for communism. For the poor Vietnamese, anything had to be better than Diem's oppressive government. Back in the United States, support for Vietnam changed with the presidents. President John F. Kennedy increased the number of American advisors and helicopter units in Vietnam to 15,000. But historians still debate if the war might have gone differently if Kennedy had seen his full term through. Diem requested American military support in stopping the guerrilla warfare, but Kennedy did not immediately send out the troops. Instead, he sent task force and experts to investigate the situation. Naturally, he received conflicting reports. Some said that the North could be contained, but others said the war would be fought in villages, making it unwinnable. Kennedy knew Diem needed to be replaced, but he was still hesitant to deploy troops. When Kennedy was assassinated, President Lyndon B. Johnson took office in 1963. There were a lot of complicating factors to America's involvement, like the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But the decision Johnson had to make was either commit to war or withdraw. In 1965, America was officially at war with Vietnam. Why did America lose the Vietnam War? Some of Kennedy's advisors had been right. A foreign force could not win the Vietnam War because the fighting happened in villages. The United States was not fighting a specific group, making enemy identification difficult since soldiers were constantly attacked by guerrilla insurgents, the Viet Cong. They were fighting an idea more than a country or an army, and ideas aren't easily defeated with military weapons. Johnson first tried to bomb North Vietnam into surrender with Operation Rolling Thunder. American military policy made a few crucial assumptions. First, they assumed that they could disrupt the supply chain in North Vietnam called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Without supplies, the war effort would fail. However, the Americans did not realize that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was an elaborate system of tunnels and jungle paths that usually ran through dense foliage. It was impossible to see from the air, and there were so many paths that supplies could simply be redirected. Second, they assumed that the Viet Cong would not be able to function without power plants or ammunition depots. But they did not consider that the Vietnamese could import their ammunition from China and the Soviet Union. Third, they assumed that there was a communist headquarters deep in the jungle that had to be destroyed. While there was a central group of people in charge of the Viet Cong, there was no physical headquarters. These individuals moved constantly and often had meetings in tunnels, keeping them mostly hidden from the American bombings that sought to destroy an HQ that did not exist. American soldiers arrived in the spring of 1965, full of confidence that they would be home by Christmas. The American war machine had never been beaten, so the troops had no doubts that the war would be quick and easy. Their reality check came at the end of 1965, in the Ia Drang Valley. On November 14th, the United States Army learned that about 2,500 communist soldiers were there, so they sent in around 2,000 men. The troops came under enemy fire, and the fighting was fierce for 3 days. The Vietnamese troops proved themselves to be tenacious masters of camouflage, continuing to fire even after taking a direct hit. When the fighting at the Ia Drang Valley was finished, the United States had lost about 230 soldiers, with around 250 wounded and 350 South Vietnamese casualties, while the People's Army, the North Vietnamese forces, lost around 1,000. Both sides claimed victory, but the U.S. lost about half of the force it had sent in. The engagement was a disaster, but not all of President Johnson's advisors saw the warning. They continued to push for American involvement, stating that the United States could win a war through attrition. Although the United States did not appear to take any lessons from the Ia Drang Valley, North Vietnam developed its winning strategy: hug them by the belt buckle, which meant keeping Vietnamese troops so close to the Americans that they couldn't use artillery or aerial support. The American war machine had several flaws that inhibited its success. One of the main things they did was rotate troops. Soldiers would serve 12-month tours and then go home. That meant that soldiers were removed as soon as they understood the military situation. So the American soldiers on the ground were usually unprepared and inexperienced in fighting the Viet Cong. This contrasted with the Viet Cong and the People's Army, which fought until victory or death. They were able to draw from their experiences to improve their tactics, something the American troops could not take advantage of. The cost of the war also began to take its toll on the United States. Not only were the financial costs mounting, but the draft was rapidly turning the conflict into a working-class war. Public opinion was turning against it, especially as thousands of soldiers came home in coffins. President Johnson tried to manage public opinion, but in 1968, the Tet Offensive showed America that the communists could launch a major attack instead of only using sporadic guerrilla warfare. Johnson could not stop the images of the war from broadcasting right into people's homes. The public saw the total military disarray, and as they realized that they were not going to get the promised victory and that war could continue indefinitely, the American people decided they wanted out. Unfortunately for them, President Nixon was elected, and he kept American troops in Vietnam for another 5 years without any significant military advances. In 1969, the draft calls were reduced, and soldiers started to return home. Peace talks had finally begun in 1968, with a lot of delays, but peace was eventually obtained in 1973. After American troops pulled out in 1973, North and South Vietnam continued their fight, and the whole country fell to communism in 1975. The United States lost the Vietnam War because they did not understand the Vietnamese culture or history. They were so busy fighting against communism that they did not fully consider that wars are fought with people. The American war machine failed to adapt to the unique aspects of the Vietnam War, and they were ultimately defeated by a combined effort of the Viet Cong and the American home front. To learn more about the Vietnam War, check out our book, Vietnam War, A Captivating Guide to the Second Indochina War. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.